Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for this version of Carr-Ryan in Conversation. My name is Matthias Risse. I'm the director of the Carr-Ryan Center for Human Rights. And it is my great pleasure today to welcome back to campus Ken Roth, who is a long-standing friend of our center. And much more importantly, of course, one of the strongest voices in human rights in recent decades, one of the most prominent defenders of human rights in recent decades. Was the executive director of Human Rights Watch for 30 years, and since then has distilled his experiences in that very important leadership role into a wonderful book that just came out fairly recently that I encourage all of you to read if you haven't already, called Righting Wrongs, which captures the mission of Human Rights Watch. So important to understand about Human Rights Watch: yes, they do write reports, they do watch, and they put down what they have watched. But then the really ingenious work that they're doing comes by using the information that they watched and wrote down, and so they use various any number really of diplomatic channels to bring this information to bear on generating real change in the world. And so how they do that is explained in detail for a number of scenarios and countries and contexts in Ken's wonderful book. Ken is also notoriously knowledgeable about every corner in the world, and we were just reminiscing about this a bit. So one great memory of Ken's presence on campus is a dinner we had in the faculty club a couple of years ago, where that included a few students here also from the Kennedy School, and there was one student from Eswatini. Eswatini, this is formerly known as Swaziland, and I assure you the conversation that we had about Eswatini, mostly the student from Eswatini and Ken with his great knowledge about Eswatini, that conversation was probably the longest conversation about Eswatini ever at Harvard University. So you can test him on anything. He passed Eswatini, so the knowledge test is any corner of the world. So today, of course, we are talking about a country that is very prominent in the news for in ways in which one would hope it wasn't. So we're talking about Iran. And the topic today, so Ken will talk about this for 20 minutes a bit, share some thoughts, and then he and I will talk a bit, and then open to you. War, law, and what comes next, the Iran reckoning. Please join me in welcoming Ken Roth back to campus.
Well, Matthias, it's great to be back here at now the Carr-Ryan Center. I think the first time I spoke with that name, but it's a nice evolution. And what I thought I would do this morning and this afternoon is talk about three dimensions of Iran. One, the decision to go to war. Second, the way the war has been fought. And third, where are we going from now? From here, what should be done? And I'll do this pretty briefly because I'd like to mainly just have conversation. First, the decision to go to war. The way to analyze whether this was lawful or not, and I'm going to address this as a matter of international law, not domestic, but the way to analyze it is to start with the UN Charter. And the UN Charter was designed to minimize resort to war. And so it imposes pretty strict standards before one country can attack another. And it is, in essence, a two, or you could call it a three-part test. None of which was present in the case of the decision to attack. One, which we can dispense with very quickly, is, was there a UN Security Council resolution authorizing the attack? Obviously not. So, done with that. The second is, was there an actual or imminent armed attack? Now, let's unpack that for a moment. There obviously was no actual attack. There have been various times in the past when Iran has attacked, but in terms of, right now, was there any military action by Iran against others? No. The idea of an imminent armed attack, if you look at sort of the analysis of what the Charter means, it generally requires, something like massing troops at the border, loading the missiles into the missile launcher, something suggesting that military action in response was required as a matter of self-defense. And nobody claims that Iran was doing that. if you listen to Trump's video speech that he gave as the war was being launched, he, recited a series of rationale. In part it was historically, these are the things that Iran has done in the past. But he essentially was saying, Iran poses a threat. They have a nuclear program. They developed all of these missiles and drones. They're supporting proxy armed groups throughout the region. Iran is a threat, so therefore, as a matter of self-defense, we can attack Iran. That was the essence of his justification. It sounds nice, but the problem with that is what he's describing is a preventive war. So not a war in response to an imminent armed attack, but rather a war to fend off some possible future threat. And that doesn't count under the UN Charter. The reason the Charter talks about an actual or imminent armed attack is to distinguish future threats. And the reason that that's important is because, everybody poses a potential future threat. If that were the standard, you would have wars left and right. And the point of the Charter was to maximize resort to diplomacy, minimize resort to military force. And so, taken at its best case, this idea that this was self-defense to prevent a war in the future is not a legal justification. That's what Trump put forward. Now, it's worth mentioning one other possible justification for war, which actually isn't in the Charter, but is developed in the years since then. And that is the concept of humanitarian intervention. Sometimes referred to as the responsibility to protect, or R2P. And under Kofi Annan, there was a big assembly of world leaders at a huge world conference, which signed off on this concept that humanitarian intervention, that is to say using military force for humanitarian purposes, is sometimes justified. There's never been agreement on when that sometimes is. But I've written quite a bit about this, and the way I have looked at this is that because war by its nature involves killing, at least soldiers, often civilians, there should be a relatively high standard before you can justify using military force. So I actually am not one to say you can never use military force for humanitarian purposes. I do think that there are circumstances. But I have tended to define it as in response to an actual or imminent genocide or comparable mass slaughter. So genocide involves ethnic, racial, religious, national terms. You can also have political mass killing, which isn't a genocide, but is still a similar crime against humanity. And I think in those circumstances, if that's what was presented, I wouldn't object. I would say this could be justified as a humanitarian intervention. But the best that Trump could come up with is that in January, the Iranian regime killed at least 7,000 demonstrators, if not more. Now, but obviously the intervention didn't happen in January. It happened at the end of March. So there was not an ongoing or imminent mass slaughter. This is something that had just happened, but it had stopped. And because of the danger of war, because of the killing inherent in war, I think the concept of humanitarian intervention should be limited to circumstances where you're stopping ongoing killing, not just to kind of punish somebody in the past. For past work, that's what you have international justice for. So I think that this, as I feel it's properly understood, fails the test of humanitarian intervention as well. So I think there's no fair assessment of what Trump and Netanyahu did, but to call it an act of aggression. This was a crime. And this is ignoring completely the War Powers Act, the domestic angle. And even if you take Trump's best case, which was his video presentation, it doesn't rise to the occasion. So that's my view of the start of the war. Now, regardless of how a war starts, it can still be fought within or in violation of international humanitarian law. So, whether the initial war was justified or not, it still should comply with the Geneva Conventions and their protocols. And so an independent assessment really has to be made as to whether what's known as IHL for international humanitarian law, whether that was respected. And in many ways, it's too early to say because there have not been independent investigations allowed on the ground. We have certain very visible situations that we can assess at this point. And it's not a great record. I think the first thing it's worth noting is that the signals from the top have been horrendous when it comes to IHL. So, Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, the most senior civilian commander other than Trump, has been utterly dismissive of humanitarian law. He's the one who called the rules of engagement, which are basically the way that humanitarian law is codified within U.S. military doctrine. He called those rules stupid. He said that he wants lethality, not legality. These are not the messages, of somebody who's pushing for respect for the law. He has fired a large number of the JAGs and the officials who were responsible for enforcing humanitarian law within the military. He has closed the office that was set up under Biden that is designed to minimize civilian casualties and to learn lessons from war to try to prevent further civilian harm. So his message, kind of left and right, has been, we don't care about this stuff. Now, it's hard to know how much that matters as you go down the chain of command. I mean, my contacts with the U.S. military suggest that sort of within the commanders, within the lawyers, there actually is big buy-in to IHL. So I don't want to kind of overstate the amount of significance that we should attach to this, political noise at the top. But it is worth noting that this totally sent the wrong message. Now, in terms of actual incidents, let me begin with one by Israel, but then I want to focus mainly on stuff by the United States. The most visible Israeli problem was when they attacked these huge oil depots outside of Tehran. And, you could sort of ask, well, why was this even a target? And I suppose they would have said, the military uses petroleum, or the military gets some revenue from the petroleum. It'd be something like that. But the mere fact that there is some military benefit from attacking a target is not the end of the story. Any kind of dual-use target, or rather any target, requires separately what's known as a proportionality analysis. You've got to ask, is the anticipated civilian harm disproportionate when weighed against the concrete and direct military advantage from destroying this target? And it is very hard to make that case with these oil depots, which dumped, toxic waste, polluted the air with toxic smoke for millions of residents of Tehran. Who knows what the long-term cost is going to be. But this is the kind of analysis that Israel is notorious for not doing in Gaza. And they clearly, at least in this case, didn't do it in Iran. Now, looking at the United States, the biggest, mistake, if you want to be generous, that they made was attacking this girls' elementary school, where, the numbers I've seen range from 168 to 175, but a lot of mostly young schoolgirls were killed. Why did they hit this? I don't believe they wanted to kill a bunch of schoolgirls. They hit this because it was adjacent to a Revolutionary Guard military base. And the real question is, why didn't they notice that it was separate? It was next door to, but separate from. It was fenced off. It had different entrances. if you had bothered looking at the satellite imagery, and the commercially available satellite imagery shows this, I'm sure the Pentagon stuff shows it much more clearly, you see the plague equipment. You know, if they'd looked, they would have seen every morning girls showing up, every afternoon girls leaving, you know. If you went on the website, it's listed on the web. You know, I mean, the slightest due diligence would have raised questions about, is this the same as the military base next door, or is it different? Somebody didn't do the due diligence. And we don't know why. You know, the Pentagon says it's going to investigate. Who knows how independent that investigation will be. You know, this could have just been an unfortunate mistake. You know, who knows? It could have been recklessness. Somebody may just not have cared to really bother. And that distinction between a negligent mistake and a reckless killing is the distinction between unfortunate conduct and a war crime. And so I don't know the answer to that, but you know, the most basic due diligence should have shown that this was a distinct girls' school. Now, there have been many reports of, you know, hospitals hit and so forth, and we just don't know enough about this, you know, whether they're being targeted, whether this is collateral damage. So I can't really opine on that. I do want to speak, though, to, two things. You know, first, this is the easy part. When Trump says we're going to wipe out civilization, you know, that is a genocidal threat, okay? Do I think he meant it? You know, do I think anybody would have followed that order? No. But it just, again, it sets a tone from the top. So it's disturbing that, you know, a president, even if he is getting a little dottery in his old age, is using this kind of rhetoric. But the more significant threat has been Trump's threat to obliterate infrastructure, focusing mainly on electrical generating plants, but also sometimes he throws in desalinization plants and the like. Now, if you're going to sort of make the best case for hitting these, it would be, again, a dual-use argument. You know, soldiers drink water. You know, soldiers use electricity. You know, soldiers drive over bridges. So, you know, is there some military use of this infrastructure? Sure. Okay, that's not the end of the story. And again, it comes back to the need for proportionality analysis. You know, in Gaza, Israel tended to act as if merely demonstrating dual use was justification for destroying the target. And that is not the case. You know, dual use only brings you kind of one step through a two-step process. You know, step one is there any military utility to attacking this thing, or is it purely civilian? If it's purely civilian, it cannot be attacked. If there is some military use, you then have to go to the second part of the test, which is the proportionality analysis. You know, is the military advantage of destroying this facility sufficient to justify the civilian cost? And you know, it is virtually impossible to make that case if you're talking about, you know, desalinization plants, if you're talking about just like, you know, destroying, you know, this big new bridge that Iran had built, which clearly, you know, the destruction of it was designed just to attack a prestige target. It's kind of like Israel going after the high rises in Gaza. But what I want to focus on for a moment is the generators, the power plants. And there's an interesting history to attacking power plants, which a lot of people are not aware of, but it helps to explain why this has now come to be understood as a war crime. If you go back to the first Gulf War, to George H.W. Bush's war, the U.S. bombed and destroyed power plants in Iraq. And one of my colleagues at Human Rights Watch went to Iraq, and we toured around, and not only saw the destroyed power plants, but really was able to study what is the consequence in a modern society of losing electricity. And what she found was that, as you could predict, suddenly there's no refrigeration. There's no sanitation. Hospitals don't function. These basic elements of modern life are gone. And that causes not just discomfort, it causes death in the midst of a war. In a moment when there's acute civilian need for things like clean water or hospital care, and it's not there. And so she was able to present this cascading effect of attacking electrical generating plants. And the report that we put out actually helped to change Pentagon doctrine. And the Pentagon, at that point, had a much more static understanding of the proportionality rule. It basically said, oh, we're going to bomb that generator there. I don't see any civilians there. No proportionality problem. We're just going to destroy the plant. End of the story. And what we forced the Pentagon to do is to recognize that proportionality should be tested not just at the moment of the attack, but over time. You've got to have a more dynamic understanding of the civilian costs of any attack, and certainly attacking electricity. And with that in mind, the Pentagon changed its doctrine. And so when it came to the Kosovo War, the Pentagon, again wanted to go after Serbia's electricity, but they didn't destroy the generators. What they did is they dropped, they actually used cluster bombs, but not in the classic sense. These were not explosive cluster munitions. They were cluster munitions that dropped graphite fibers that spread over the generator and shorted it out temporarily. So for a while, a day or two, whatever, there was no electricity, but it was easy to remove the fibers. It was easy to fix the generators. There were no long-term consequences, as there would be if the generators had been destroyed. So this was a big improvement in doctrine. The Pentagon did the same thing in Bush II's invasion of Iraq. So this had become quite entrenched. What's interesting is that it was not just a matter of Pentagon doctrine, but the understanding of what international law required also changed. And so the International Criminal Court has charged 4 Russian military commanders for attacking electrical infrastructure in Ukraine. So it's not just, voluntary change of doctrine. The understanding of what the law means has changed. It is now understood that proportionality analysis must be done over time. And so there is essentially, a strong presumption, a war crime presumption against attacking generators. Trump comes along, and Trump says we're going to obliterate the generators. Now that, on its face, is threatening a war crime. The big open question is, would the Pentagon have done that? And we don't know the answer to that. But it is contrary to Pentagon doctrine. And there is this duty to ignore a law, an order that violates the law. One scenario is that Trump would say obliterate those things, and they would drop the graphite fibers again. Or if they took them literally, they would blow up the generator, and we don't know. So I think we just have to recognize that there is this tension between the crazy rhetoric from the top and the more entrenched, somewhat more lawful doctrine within the Pentagon, and we don't really know how that's playing out as Hegseth has removed so many enforcers of humanitarian law within the Pentagon. So, these are just some of the IHL complexities as we look at the conflict. Now, where do we go from here? When Trump tries to articulate the reason for this war, he's all over the place. There are a bunch of different reasons that have been offered. And so all I can really do is run through them and ask, how important are these and where should we go from here? Starting again from the presidents, that none of these justify going to war, but we are now at war, so how does Trump extricate himself from this? Let's look, as we answer that question, at what he claims he wants to accomplish. Now, the goal that I think was actually the trigger for this war was the prospect of regime change. Netanyahu walked in to the Situation Room at the White House and with a few of his military colleagues on the Zoom in the background, made the case accurately that Khamenei, at the point the supreme leader, was stupid enough, as war threatens, to be planning to meet above ground with a number of his senior officials on his compound. That was a dumb thing to do. The Israelis clearly have completely infiltrated, the Iranian government with their intelligence officers. They knew this was happening, and Netanyahu said, this is a golden opportunity. We can decapitate this regime. And this is our best chance yet to get regime change. And sure enough, Khamenei and the others, like idiots, met, and they were all killed. So it was a very successful operation, if from that perspective. The problem is there was no plan B. I think Trump assumed, Iranians had just risen up in January. We'll decapitate the regime and they'll rise up again and we'll be done with all this. But of course, one, the Iranians had just been slaughtered in January. They're not eager to take to the streets that quickly again. Second, when you're bombing a country, it's not the most natural moment for people to rally against the government. There's a tendency to rally around the flag, or just to hide so you don't get bombed. So, nobody's taken to the street to protest the government. This just hasn't happened. Trump, in his, delusional way, has said, we have a regime change. There are different people in charge now, But of course, we have the same regime with arguably more conservative policies, because it turned out that the Israelis, who just kept bombing officials, killed off people like Larjani, who was widely seen as a kind of a significant pragmatist, somebody with the clout to do that. Trump at one point, in a moment of honesty, said, we don't really know who to bargain with anymore. We killed everybody. And, it's sickly laughable. But that's, where we are. And now they've been meeting, obviously in Islamabad. The Speaker of the Parliament is somebody they all think, this is a moderate now, but nobody knows how much power he has. He's heading a huge delegation because clearly they've got to negotiate everything that happens. So there's not significant regime change. This is not Venezuela, where you can get rid of Maduro and threaten everybody else, and they all suddenly are pliant. Iran's a much more complicated place, much more ideologically committed, much more depth to the regime. So that's what we're dealing with. So regime change, there is no reason to think that more war is going to succeed. We are stuck with this regime. It's a horrible regime. I'm not an apologist for the Iranian regime, but we're stuck with them. So that goal is going nowhere at this stage. Now, a second goal was to destroy Iran's capacity to project its military threats, its attacks on Israel, the Gulf Arab states, the countries of the region. And, that's been a partial success. Clearly a lot of things have been attacked, a lot of things have been blown up. But, U.S. intelligence says that the Iranians have actually gotten quite good about, digging out missiles from caches underground that have been attacked. They are, at a lesser velocity, but a regular velocity nonetheless, attacking, principally the Gulf Arab states, occasionally Israel. They seem in this for the long term. The idea that you can kind of bomb them into being unable to deploy drones or missiles, we're a long way from that. And so the idea of going back to war because marginally you would further diminish this capacity is a very long-term project. It would take significant costs to do that. So I don't see that as being, kind of a viable reason to keep fighting. I think that at best we can say there's been, progress if you accept the U.S. Israeli goal, but not a, positive resolution to it. The big issue, obviously, the one that, has been motivating Israel and the U.S. to attack Iran periodically is the nuclear question. And here, I think we have to keep in mind the history of this. I mean, the nuclear issue was pretty contained when Trump took office for the first time. because Obama had negotiated a deal. And under the deal, the issue was really kind of kicked off into the future. There were strict limits on Iranian enrichment. There were intrusive inspections. Iran had disowned the idea of developing a nuclear weapon. Khamenei had issued a religious edict against it. It was, Iran at that stage did not pose a threat of developing a nuclear bomb. That was contained. But, Trump, who can always do better than Obama, ripped up the JPCOA, the accord, and made everything worse. Because, Iran went from having token, low-level uranium enrichment to suddenly having hundreds of pounds of 60% purity uranium, which means it's just a few weeks away from bringing it up to the 90% purity required for nuclear bomb. So I don't want to overstate that, because to go from even, 90% purity uranium to a bomb requires other things, which they don't have right now, but they may have been a year away from that. They certainly are much closer than they would have been under the Obama Accord. So, this is just, Trump being Trump, making things worse and creating a problem that he then has to solve. As you all know, last June, the U.S. and Israel bombed the nuclear program. They buried a lot of it. They didn't get rid of the highly enriched uranium that's still sitting there in canisters. And so, now the question is, what do you do about this program? And the U.S. is actually negotiating from a worse position, because Iran doesn't trust the United States anymore. They had an accord. Trump destroyed it. Why should they trust him again? They have, much more highly enriched uranium. They had none before. Now they have a whole bunch. They are, kind of have all the more incentive to develop a nuclear weapon, because, what's the difference between Iran and North Korea? North Korea has a nuclear weapon. They don't get attacked. So we are, markedly in a worse position. A deal was, in being negotiated a little over a month ago, when Trump just, preempted the negotiations and started bombing. And that deal, would have involved either shipping out or kind of more likely diluting the highly enriched uranium. It would have involved significant limitations on the right to enrich. I say the right to enrich, that's Iran's terminology. But their point is that if you look at the Non-Proliferation Treaty, every country has a right to enrich, subject to international inspections. And this, it may seem like a stupid point, but it's become a point of principle to the Iranian regime. And not one that they're going to lightly give up, because they've suffered so much already to defend it. And what seemed to be happening in February during these aborted negotiations is that they, Iran seemed willing to settle for a token right to enrichment. One idea on the table was, well, what if they can only enrich to the level that's required for kind of scientific and medical research, which is, like 1.5% purity or something. It's nothing. It clearly would be just a way for the regime to say, we retained our right to enrich, but it's nowhere near what's required to develop a nuclear weapon. Another idea being put out there was, create some kind of consortium, with the Saudis or the Emiratis, and have a regional right to enrich. There were different options on the table. The Americans were saying, well, we'll just give you the enriched uranium, don't enrich it yourself. And your refusal to accept this means you really want to develop a bomb. That's not really that doesn't take into account how much this principle mattered to the Iranians. So I'm not defending the principle. I mean, I don't really care about the right to enrich, but this is something that really does matter to the Iranians. And any feasible negotiation clearly has to take that into account. So, can this be resolved? I mean, at this point, it seems that the negotiations are split between the Iranian position saying that they would suspend enrichment for 5 years, and Trump saying you got to suspend it for 20 years. That's totally a matter for negotiation. You can split the difference, whatever. So this should be resolvable without war. But that's where we are. So, we didn't get meaningful regime change. We got modest but inadequate reduction of Iran's capacity to project. There's the question as to what should Iran stop supporting Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas. I don't know where that stands at this point. That's being negotiated. But one way in which this war has made the U.S. position much worse, strengthened the Iranian position, is that it has actually handed Iran, shown to Iran that there is a viable weapon that is arguably more powerful and certainly more usable than a nuclear weapon. And that's this thing called the Strait of Hormuz. Okay? Because until now, the idea of closing the strait was a theoretical threat. Suddenly it's a reality. They just did it. And they showed that it hurts. That they can really slow down the global economy. They can fuel inflation. They can do something that is particularly painful in the United States, which is have the price of filling up your tank of gas increase as midterm elections approach. So this is this powerful new weapon that Trump has handed to the Iranians. I mean, they always had it, but they'd never realized how easy it was to use or how powerful it was. And so Iran is suddenly coming into these negotiations feeling pretty good about its position. This is obviously a ruthless, indifferent dictatorship. So the idea that the Iranian people are suffering, I mean, that's just not a factor. They're willing to put up with a lot of suffering by Iranians in order to maintain power. And they have this new weapon, and they feel like, so why should we be compromising here? We want a better deal. And so if you look at, kind of what is on the table now, they're saying, okay, well, we want to be able to treat the Strait of Hormuz as a toll booth. We think we can make more money from tolls than we make selling oil, which, some accounts show that that's true. They say, we want reparations. That's never going to happen. But they're saying, okay, if not reparations, then we want sanctions lifted, we want access to our frozen funds, we want the toll booth. So these are big new demands, thanks to this pointless war. So, Trump has backed himself into a corner. He sees that the Republican Party is heading toward, a devastating loss in November. They could, they'll certainly lose the House. They could lose the Senate. Trump's popularity is plummeting. He is negotiating from a position of weakness because he bought Netanyahu's, don't think about tomorrow argument of, getting quick regime change and moving on with a victory. And so, this is Trump. And, nobody's coming to his assistance. The stakes are huge. He clearly at this stage knows that more war is going to hurt him, the stock market, the oil market, the ballot box. He desperately wants out. It's not a great way to negotiate. Fortunately, it seems that negotiations are going to continue in Islamabad next week. Trump has gotten Israel to agree to a ceasefire in Lebanon. Israel would love to keep fighting. I mean, unlike Trump, they would just fight and fight and fight. I mean, that's not Netanyahu's strategy. Just, mow the lawn every few years. So, he's very happy with endless war. But Trump isn't. Trump promised his base no more stupid wars, and here he's engaged in one. So, he's in a difficult situation. But it's not a moment to sort of sit here and, lick our lips at watching Trump in trouble because the stakes are just so high, And so we got to hope that some accommodation can be reached here that brings an end to this. These should be negotiable matters. If you listen to J.D. Vance, Trump is trying to think big, some huge grand scheme. But, a huge grand scheme is going to require giving in on things that he criticized Obama for, such as handing the Iranians a bunch of cash. So that's where we are. I will stop there, and I welcome your comments, questions, thoughts.
Thank you. Let me start with a few questions. So I'm trying to wrap my head around what a moral justification of this war could possibly be, and the nuclear issue is really the only one that's really worth thinking about here. And there, of course, you are right. I mean, this is a self-made problem because that problem had been solved, under Obama. But one other thing about this is also one thing that I often hear policymakers, people who know about the region, people who know about this regime across the aisle agree on is that this regime really importantly needs to be prevented from having a nuclear weapon. And in recent times, partly because of these failures earlier, right? So they as you say, they really know for sure that they can't trust the United States. So clearly they were interested in having one. So there is a moral imperative to making sure that they can't. So that would be, at this stage, even acknowledging all this history, would seem to be the best justification for a preventive war rather than a preemptive one. But that still doesn't add up in your mind to a justifiable preventive war.
Well, I mean, no, because
I know it's not legal, but
yeah, I mean, because all of this is negotiable. I mean, to even if you're going to say that, okay, a preventive war in a nuclear realm is somehow justifiable,
yeah.
even if if that were the criteria, which it's not, you still would have to say, but only if there's no reasonable route to the same solution through negotiation.
Yeah. Which there isn't, because they themselves have blocked it, basically. Right?
Well, because the U.S. has blocked it, yes.
Yeah.
But in other words, I mean, what would it take? It takes, it's going to take diluting or getting rid of the highly enriched uranium. It's going to take, a limit on enrichment, and it's going to take inspections. All of that is totally doable. I mean, the Iranians, obviously, the prior Khamenei disowned nuclear weapons. It would be useful if his son did the same. If the guy can talk, it's not clear, But leaving that aside, I mean, that's just a statement. There are very practical things that I think the Iranians would agree to. That would, I mean, this whole thing could have been solved if the Iranians could walk away and say we've retained a right to enrichment at some token, minimal, meaningless level. And Trump, whenever Trump talks about this, he never says we're going to deny them the right to enrich. He says we're going to deny them a nuclear weapon, which they say. They've been saying it for years. So that's like easy.
Yeah.
So I just think that there was this rush to war because of Netanyahu, because he thought that there'd be quick regime change and he'd solve the problem.
Yeah. On the school bombing and at the very opening of this war. So you put this very carefully, right? So you did talk about this possibly was a war crime, and the condition for this being a war crime was if basic due diligence wasn't done, but then you also say basic due diligence in fact wasn't done, and it would have been really very easy to see that in fact was a school. So basically this does all add up to a credible accusation of war crime in this case, doesn't it?
I think there's I think you could presumptively say it was reckless.
Yeah.
I'd like to know on the inside what happened.
Yeah.
And maybe you can find that out, maybe not.
Yeah.
If they covered up, that would be evidence against them.
Yeah.
But it's worth at this stage saying, let's have an investigation to see what exactly happened before coming to a definitive conclusion.
Yeah, but it just sounded like, given what you said about how basic this actually was, it seems like
they should have seen.
So that's why I'm wondering why you are so guarded about this assessment.
I mean, because I just don't know for sure. But no, I mean, certainly, if you look at it circumstantially, this looks like it was reckless. Yeah.
So one other thing that's intriguing to look at is the dynamics in the Pentagon here, right? So since clearly we have seen this now for some time, beginning with this massive summoning of all major leaderships from around the world on some random Tuesday or Wednesday, I think last year in the Pentagon, that Trump and Hegseth are trying very hard to bring the military in line, so that they will basically follow any orders, which is a major effort because say what you like about the American military, they have proud traditions of actually sticking to humanitarian law, and as you mentioned, since the Iraq War in the 90s, they have done a whole lot of humanitarian learning internally, right? So in particular, in terms of the proportionality assessments. So the question then is, from what you see about leadership development, you know about basically these ranks that have not been removed yet. How much trust do you have as a human rights person in the American military to say no to blatantly anti-humanitarian illegal orders if it actually comes to that?
Yeah. I mean, I worry about that these days. I mean, you may remember that the a group of senators and Congress people put out a video, appealing to service members to resist illegal orders, which is what the law says. That's what they're required to do. That goes back to Nuremberg. And Trump said this is sedition, and wanted them prosecuted. So that's a terrible signal from the top.
Yeah.
the most recent evidence that we have that they are willing to follow an illegal order is the fact that they have been summarily executing drug suspects in the Caribbean and the Eastern Pacific.
Yeah.
Because, even if we assume, where there have been very little evidence, but let's assume that these boats are trafficking drugs, there is no war. You can't treat these people as combatants just by having Trump say that we're in a war. These are people who are allegedly committing crimes. They should be interdicted and prosecuted, which is what the Coast Guard always did until now. So the fact that the military has been willing to just execute the people from the air, when this is, everybody looks at this, says that this is illegal. It's not a war crime because there's no war. It's just murder.
Yeah.
That's troubling.
Yeah.
So I do worry about whether this, basic ethos of respecting the law is viable these days.
And then we have in addition this the statement about basically the genocidal threat, right, last week that we saw, and you say, he didn't mean it, right? But
He
Trump,
meant it, but I don't think they would have carried it.
Well, he meant it in a Trump sort of way, right? He puts all the stuff out there, and then he says, "Oh, I was joking, and I didn't really mean it." And but of course, he is basically he's preparing the ground, right? This is the oxygen in which genuine atrocities breathe, and that's why the question about how worried one should be about where the military is going with all this.
Well, also, I think the way it would have been carried out is by attacking infrastructure.
Yeah.
So it would have, it's not great solace to say it wouldn't have been genocide. It would have been just one big, massive war crime. Great.
Yeah. Let's talk about the Iranian situation a little bit. So one thing that he said, this is actually something I had not seen this way so far. I thought the kind of control that Israel has over the situation is very much driven by their surveillance ability. So basically anybody in the region makes a phone call, they know about it. Mm-hmm. But you actually say there's much more to that. They have actually penetrated at the personnel level the Iranian regime. So that's actually Israeli spies in the...
Do I know? No.
Yeah. But you assume
they know a whole lot.
Yeah.
So they knew that this incredibly high-level meeting, they knew where it was going to take place and when.
Yeah.
Maybe that's not that hard to figure out, but they clearly have penetrated in one way or the other.
Yeah.
Senior Israeli.
They managed to get Hezbollah operatives these pager devices with built-in explosives. So clearly the reach of Israeli secret services is.
And they've been bombing. They've been bombing particular apartments and apartment buildings.
Yeah. To
kill nuclear scientists or whatever. So they've been extremely knowledgeable about whom to target and when.
Yeah. So about the situation of the Strait of Hormuz. So one thing I was thinking about, and I think you're absolutely right about this analysis, that they have empowered and enabled Iran by fully understanding now how they can really do harm to the world. Right? One could have known in advance that this is a situation. The Straits of Hormuz is very easy to control through a bunch of cheap drones. But exactly how easy this would be and how much damage it would be causing, they have learned that now. Right? So then, of course, one can think about how can one disable that weapon, right? And that leads them to the question, how else could one get that oil out of there? And of course, we're talking about such magnitudes of oil. The answer is probably there's no other way except through container ships, and that also puts us in the Strait of Hormuz because that's the only navigable way. Yeah. Is there, this is just a question that just popped to my mind. Is there any thought that Saudi Arabia would say we're going to build half a dozen pipelines from the Persian Gulf to the Red Sea, and we're creating a completely different way of getting the oil away from the region?
There is a pipeline. Yes. But its capacity is much less.
Yeah, but could they say we'll just build another dozen of them? It would take a while.
It would take a while. Look at it. The other answer is solar. There are other alternatives.
Solar, so just make the oil redundant.
Yeah.
Of course, that would be a good idea anyway.
Yeah.
So one last question, and then I'll open up to your question. So, how much do we actually understand about the dynamics, the political dynamics, the level of interconnectedness, organization of the protests in Iran? So we've seen, of course, these massive uprisings. Iran is a huge country, 90 million people. There were these massive uprisings in January that we have seen much higher estimates of victims than. So I know you're kind of cautiously conservative about this.
7,000 is the lowest number.
It's the lowest number, yeah. So what do we? What is the nature of the protest in Iran according to our best understanding. This is just basically when it flares up, is that on occasions when things are so bad that basically the signaling is independently followed all over the country. People are just getting so alienated because after all these years of economic deprivation and political oppression, there certain sparks are just generating protest everywhere, and then they're getting oppressed everywhere. Or is there some level of internal interconnectedness, organization that speaks to some level of civil society there?
I don't think we know for sure, but my guess would be that there is widespread hatred of the regime, and it just takes a spark that travels through, partly through social media, partly through word of mouth. But it was obviously, what was her name, Mahala, the woman who was killed for having the wrong hijab or wearing a bad hijab. That was just such an outrageous incident that it sparked protests around the country, and ultimately they were suppressed. This past January was more economically oriented, but there is so much hatred for this regime that every 2-3 years you get these mass protests. So far they have been able to ruthlessly suppress them. I don't know how long that lasts. Bashar al-Assad thought that ruthlessness would keep him in power forever. It didn't work out. So we'll have to see.
Okay, the floor is open. We have a mic. So if you'd like to introduce yourself, that's always appreciated. Since we are recording this, I am not actually asking you to, but again, always grateful if you do. Who would like to start? Yes.
Thank you, Ken. Excellent as always. Darian Swig. I understand that the U.S. is not a signatory of the Rome Statute, but can you foresee in the future, when Trump is gone, that there's any pathway for accountability for people like Hexas, like through the International Criminal Court? Is there any possibility there that you could envision?
Yes. There are actually 2 routes to the International Criminal Court, and then it's also worth talking about universal jurisdiction. But the 2 routes to the International Criminal Court are, one, Iran joins the court and gives it retroactive jurisdiction. That's what Ukraine did, which is why the court has jurisdiction going back to 2014 in Ukraine. The other route would be a new administration comes in and decides not to veto a UN Security Council referral. So either of those would give the ICC jurisdiction. I think the more likely one is the Iranian accession to the Rome Statute, but of course they can't do this only for the U.S. They have to do it for themselves too, and they would be worried about prosecution for crimes against humanity for slaughtering protesters. So that's probably not going to happen. But although a lot of the people who ordered that are now dead, so maybe But so that's yes, theoretically we could get to ICC jurisdiction, but those are the obstacles. The other route is universal jurisdiction. And if it's universal jurisdiction for war crimes, that's not that hard. It just takes somebody who is willing to stand up to the United States. But we don't yet, I don't think, have systematic U.S. war crimes. We have threatened systematic war crimes. So I think if it's just where we stand right now, I don't see universal jurisdiction occurring. But if Trump were to start following through and start attacking left and right infrastructure, then maybe. Now that would work for Hegseth. It would work for even for Trump with respect to war crimes. Then there's a separate issue of aggression, which is where Trump is vulnerable, and he uniquely is vulnerable because this is his war and Netanyahu's. The difficulty with aggression is that, and in fact even with the war crimes, is that aggression doesn't have access to the ICC at all because the rules are different. You need the government in question to agree. The U.S. would never agree. Unless a new administration came in and agreed. Even with respect to war crimes, universal jurisdiction cannot be used against a head of state, a head of government, or a foreign minister. The International Court of Justice has said this because it's prioritized their exercising their functions over justice. It's a bad decision. That's what we're stuck with. So the way around that, there's an exception the court noted that an international tribunal can go after these people. And that's why the Council of Europe has created, or is in the process of creating, a tribunal for aggression in Ukraine, because that's the only way to go after Putin. And theoretically, something like that could happen for Trump as well. It would take, Council of Europe, European Union, G7 or NATO minus the United States, whatever. The court never defined what an international tribunal is. So it, referenced the ICC, which is not a UN body, it's just a treaty. And so in a sense, any group of countries could join together with a treaty setting up a tribunal, which would seem to satisfy the ICJ's opinion. So that's, those are the hoops you'd need to jump through to get a prosecution of Trump.
Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for this talk. I want to go back to the incident of the school children. There is some allegations that say there is an AI, artificial intelligence, that was used. That's why the human due diligence wasn't there. And of course, no one knows if this is true, and no one will confirm.
Yeah.
And again, in the Venezuela case, also that was the seed of the problem between Anthropic and the Department of Defense or War. So I wonder how you see it from a human rights perspective, the effects of the artificial intelligence on human rights, and what guardrails can be done. And of course, it's a fast progressing thing that will go out of control.
Okay, let me answer your question by saying I don't think that's what happened in Iran or Venezuela. It is what happened in Gaza. So let me answer it and then explain what's wrong with that. The reason I say I don't think it happened in Iran is you don't need AI to notice this huge military base. They all knew it was there. And so, the question as to what is the perimeter of the military base, that's not an AI question. That's something that individuals study. AI is used the way the Israelis have used it in Gaza to try to determine, who is a Hamas fighter. So you have, a bunch of phone calls, you have a bunch of movement on the ground, all this data, you throw it into AI, it says this person's Hamas, that person's not. And in theory, some person reviews that. In fact, the numbers are so large that the person who is doing the reviewing is utterly deferential. And so AI is deciding who gets killed. It basically is a killer robot. And so that is extremely troublesome. We basically are delegating life-death decisions to a computer. And we should be very reluctant to do that. I think the answer to that is to require, meaningful human oversight. Having a real person in the loop, not just a person who kind of looks at that and says, oh, it's probably all fine. And we don't have those standards yet. There's been an effort to negotiate this in Geneva, which has been going incredibly slowly and has not been satisfactory so far.
So speaking of robots, we learned that Ukraine used robots, last week against the Russians. And so presumably, are these your killer robots right there, and what's happening in Ukraine?
Yeah, Ukraine is getting close to it. It's, Ukraine has become drone warfare. And there have been, among the defensive tools, has been jamming. And so, the drone operator sitting in the trench loses contact with the drone, and it just crashes someplace. So how do you counteract that? There is kind of, for a while they were doing it by having these long fibers, and they're like the area is just like, drenched with fibers. But they are experimenting with, putting GPS into the drone and basically saying, this is where you're going. That's not a killer robot, that's kind of still targeted. A killer robot would be more like, this is what a Russian looks like, go find one. That would be more killer robot. I don't know what you're referring to.
No, the
but-
BBC
Yeah.
said that there were robots, real robots, not drones,
Oh, yeah, okay,
on the battlefield, and Russians were surrendering to them.
Okay, but that's, okay, again, that's, you gotta read the fine print. You know, were these being operated by a person or not? The fact that you're having a robot, I mean, they use robots to demine, that's okay. You know, the mere fact that you have some robotic entity is not objectionable if a human is controlling it. It's objectionable only if you say, this is what I want to go find somebody who looks like this and kill them, and you let them go. That becomes a killer robot.
Yeah, I mean, the BBC didn't tell us whether there were operators behind it. You're just saying, obviously, there were operators if there were robots.
I don't think they've got autonomous robots now.
Okay.
No. You know, and so that's, I mean, that's the objectionable part, it's the autonomy. Yes.
Hi, I'm Linda Bacon-Grin. You sort of opened my eyes to an issue that I hadn't really thought about. The pundits suggest that Trump should just say, I won, like he always does, and then his people will agree even if he didn't win. But are you suggesting that there really isn't a deal for Trump because of the geography of the Strait of Hormuz? That Trump has woken up the Iranians to this power that they'll have at least until, as Matthias suggested, somebody builds some more pipelines
Yeah.
or something.
Well,
They're always gonna have this, and they can do a deal tomorrow, but next week it might be different, and they now have the keys to the economy.
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, at the Strait of Hormuz probably could be resolved by declaring victory. In other words, where if Trump just says, okay, we're gonna do a permanent ceasefire if they stop blocking the Strait of Hormuz, that'd probably be sufficient. But that doesn't solve the nuclear issue. You know, so there is the need for a deal. I mean, there's a limit to just declaring victory. Trump needs an agreement of some sort. You know, or you know, Iran is gonna have both the highly enriched uranium and the motive to turn into a bomb. You know, so there is a real problem there right now. I just think that that nuclear deal, it was, you know, Obama had the deal. There was a deal to be had in February. There's still a deal to be had now. This is not that complicated, you know, but it just requires some willingness for Trump, you know, not to just issue edicts, but to negotiate. You know, when J.D. Vance goes to Islamabad and said, we presented our ideas and they said no, well, duh. You know, that's not how negotiations work, you know. So there's, you know, but that can still be done.
Yes.
So, a question about the regime versus the people of Iran. And so, I was in Iran during the JCPOA, and it seemed to me that 95% of the people I ran into in Iran loved Americans. And if you listen to, you know, what happened in January, I think I've heard a lot of Iranians say that Trump said 8 times help was on the way, and he didn't come. So that may have turned off the population. Is there a way of appealing to the population? Maybe we're asking to refer leaders to the ICC, you know, releasing people from prison. Is there a way to kind of differentiate and have the government of the United States support the people more overtly and maybe encourage a new regime that appears that would actually make a deal with us? I mean, it's a long shot.
I mean, the problem is the regime is not a democratic regime, so it's not, you know, responsive to public pressure the way democracy is. You know, Trump said, rise up, you know, we're with you, but then, you know, left him in the lurch. The U.S. has a long history of urging people to rise up and they get slaughtered. And so, I mean, the Iranians know what happened to the Iraqis, you know, so I don't think Trump does any favors to U.S. relations with the Iranian people by bombing infrastructure, by, you know, attacking bridges. I mean, who's that hurting? You know, not the regime, the people. So I don't think Trump has been handling this well.
Thank you for your session. I'm actually from Iran.
Okay.
I've been here for 47 years. I've not been back to Iran since I was 15. So for me, this is very personal, and I love the things you're saying. Obviously, I'm very familiar with, and I have a lot more details about some of the things that are going on the ground because I have family and friends there. So my question is, I mean, this regime is a brutal regime. Eventually, there will be their downfall, maybe not this year, but maybe 5-10 years down the road. I think if the U.S. cuts a deal with them, they would just give them extra lifeline to remain. And so they're going to take advantage of that and to keep building and empowering themselves for survival. I mean, they've been surviving for 45 years at the detriment of their own people. I mean, they have built cities on the ground with bunkers and hospitals and food and ammunition, and that because they know they have nowhere else to go. So, but by letting them, giving them some breathing room, we will actually empower them to remain in power. So sanctions, I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on sanctions. I don't think we should give them free up any of the sanctions or give them any relief. And second, I would love your opinion on where China is on all of this.
Yeah. Well, I think, I mean, the point you're making, which is that the regime may emerge from these new negotiations stronger than before. I think sadly you're right. I mean, that was the problem with ripping up the JPCOA. That's the problem with not accepting a negotiated deal in February and going to war. I mean, this was not only a dumb, pointless war, but it was counterproductive. And so at this point, given that Iran has the Strait of Hormuz weapon, given this call for war reparations, they're in a stronger position to say, okay, you want us to deal with enriched uranium, you want us to kind of forswear some level of enrichment, we need money to rebuild. And if you don't want us to set up a toll booth in the Strait of Hormuz, then you've got to let us, get our seized assets back. You got to let us, have sanctions lifted. So these are all things that are going to help the regime, absolutely. And this is why, Trump, there's no plan B. It's just, he just bought the Netanyahu line that this could all be decapitated. So it's sad.
Let's have one last question.
Well, thank you very much for your explanations. There is a third party on this war, which is Israel, and they were attacked by Hezbollah, which is a proxy of Iran, and all those missiles that Iran has, long and medium range, they are able to get to Israel, and they have been attacking Israel. So, what's your analysis on that combatant in Israel?
Well, I mean, first of all, Iran has been sending missiles to Israel only after Israel attacks Iran. So, we should make clear, what's been initiating these conflicts. Netanyahu doesn't want a negotiated solution. His answer to everything is pretty much forever war. That's Gaza, that's Iran, that's southern Lebanon. So, that's where he's pushing. Now, but it's not like Israel's a fully autonomous agent here. Trump completely has it within his capacity to tell Netanyahu to stop. And Netanyahu has to stop because he can't do any of this without ongoing U.S. military aid, arms, intelligence, defense, especially with Iran. So Trump is really in the driver's seat here. We shouldn't pretend that Netanyahu is just doing his own thing. And we saw this just today where Israel's ongoing bombing of southern Lebanon was impeding the negotiation that Trump wants to succeed with Iran. And so Trump just told Netanyahu to stop, and he did. And that's the same dynamic played out in Gaza. Why do we have a ceasefire today? Because Trump insisted on one.
So, Ken, maybe as a way of rounding this out, what's your best prediction of how this will end? Because Trump is clearly a man in a hurry here, because he can say as many times as he likes that the United States has enough oil and gas so that the conflict doesn't affect the energy situation here. It's world market prices, so people are not going to be fooled by that. And the midterms are coming up, and it's not looking good for him anyway. And this is just going to make it worse for him the closer we get to the election. So he has a good reason to get out of this. What is your best guess as to how that will happen?
I mean, my guess is there's going to be a deal. They will probably extend these 2 weeks because it's just too complicated to get done in 2 weeks. It's going to be a deal that, from the U.S. perspective, is worse than they would have had in February. And Trump will then try to sell this as a victory.
Well, let victory be the last word, and we can follow our association separately with that. Or do you want to say something else except like a Trump victory?
If if it ends, it'll be a victory for the Iranian people, although I take the caveat here that the regime, they're still stuck with them.
Yeah. Please join me in thanking Ken Roth for this.